Surgical procedures were still highly intrusive in those days, and after removing herniated discs, I discovered the incision was around 15 centimeters long. The surgeons had anticipated a smaller incision but were obligated to lengthen it due to the discovery during the operation that the herniated discs were positioned on multiple spinal discs, as well as a congenital bone protuberance that they considered would be beneficial to remove. They had to use a hammer and a drill to make the removal successful, in addition to prolonging the incision and the duration of the anesthesia. And, whether due to an anesthetist error or the length of the process, the unthinkable occurred. I awoke during the operation, right as they were using the hammer and drill on my sacral bones. I recall the scorching agony on my spine, which seemed like it was the result of a fire right there. I couldn't say anything or make any sounds from my face-down position, so I lifted my head slightly to let them know I was awake. I only had time to watch the anesthetist place an oxygen mask over my face before falling back into the black silence of anesthesia. I awoke shortly after, in a bed, being moved down a corridor, and as soon as I got conscious, I remember the searing pain in my spine and found myself instantly outside of my body. The agony went away quickly, but I kept flying away from my bed and down the corridor quicker. With great astonishment, I discovered that my journey did not terminate at the end of the lengthy corridor, but instead transformed into an endless luminous tunnel through which I continued to glide without interruption. I kept going faster and faster until the tunnel abruptly ended and I found myself in a large, dazzling space. I was finally still, surrounded by warmth and enveloped in white light. It felt like being in a warm mist, with glimpses of other people's shadows passing past. I felt heavenly feelings, well-being, joy, peace, and a sensation of being protected. I would describe the light during my real encounter as a bath in the subtle material essence of love. I strolled around for a few minutes, startled, interested, and unable to explain to myself why I was still alive. I began to consider what I should do. Somehow, a big white throne appeared within the mist, on which sat our eternal Father, as we generally know him, an old man with a beard and long white hair. I proceeded to sprint to him with arms wide open, without doubt, shyness, or consideration. I felt like a happy child reunited with a long-lost father. "How wonderful," I exclaimed as I rushed. "I finally tracked you down." I didn't have a mouth to talk. The response arrived at the same time. I felt a magnetic force block my course and heard the remark, "No, it's too soon for you," from the man on the throne, a similar image used in coffee advertising. I didn't have time to think about it because the voice said, "There are many people who still need you. You must turn around and assist them." There was no way I could say no. The encounter came to an end when the answer was definitive. I found myself quickly back in my body, which had begun to awaken from anesthesia in my hospital room's bed. Those first few seconds following awakening were sad. I was convinced I was dead and asked my family and doctors to validate my survival. They all tried to reassure me, but I remained perplexed because I was still experiencing extrasensory impressions, which made me doubt that I had returned to my normal existence. I heard voices from far away, in the corridors, and even on the floors above my floor. I knew this was a super auditory impact. I occasionally heard a heavy buzzing in my ears, which grew louder and louder until it sounded like the screeching of a sawmill. When the sound was at its most intense, I would become disconnected from reality and see a series of picture frames on a screen. The speed of these image frames slowed until I could see a real-time scene in which I was the protagonist. The scrolling sped up, then slowed again to depict a scenario in real time. This halting and scrolling occurred multiple times. Feelings, emotions, phrases, gestures, and meetings all occurred as I was living them at the time. I was terrified of this extrasensory experience, which occurred 2 or 3 times during those bizarre days following the excursion to the beyond. I tried to acquire an explanation from relatives and doctors, but no one knew what was going on, what it signified, or what caused it. I was astounded to realize that I could read the minds of all these folks. Now, I was completely lost and terrified. I was at a loss for words as to how to express what was occurring to me. My medical team had requested that a psychologist visit me in my hospital room on the 3rd and 4th days to verify my mental state. In this case, being able to read minds came in handy since I realized right away that they planned to inject sedatives and psychopharmacological substances. I pretended to be calm and avoided mentioning my difficulties. I kept my extrasensory perceptions and experience with another dimension to myself. The psychologists arrived the next day, and I pretended to be a patient who was only recovering physically and had been diagnosed with slight abnormalities post-anesthesia. My physical rehabilitation was critical, and I was able to walk on my own after only 5 or 6 days. As a result, I was able to dwell about my situation while walking down the corridor. I was able to confide in my family, but they were merely scared and couldn't offer any good reasons. The psychologist at the Center for Mental Health couldn't assist me, and even if he could, he would only have harmed my neurons, which I thought were working better than ever. I tried again with the doctors, but as soon as they learned of my extrasensory perceptions, they demanded that the psychologist be brought back. Later, I was able to speak with other doctors outside of the hospital, but no one could explain or understand the unusual images and power that I'd never heard of or encountered in my life. I went down to the hospital chapel once I could manage the steps. I needed to speak with the chaplain. Deep down, I wondered if it was possible to communicate with the Eternal Father while still alive. I attended a chapel event, after which I waited for the priest to emerge. "Father, I was dead and I met our Eternal Father who sent me back here," I said flatly. "What caused this to happen?" I was overcome with emotion and realized I'd been too frank. The priest's thoughts were racing, and he was convinced that my bizarre query had something to do with my recovery. He responded in a comforting tone, asking me to stay calm. He inquired as to what I was doing with my life. I replied that I was a member of a sports group for disabled people. He tried to persuade me that this was an admirable pursuit and that it was sufficient to unlock the gates to paradise. He put an end to the situation by telling me that I would be alright and that I would forget about this incident. I tried to appear satisfied and requested him not to disclose our chat to my family because I didn't want them to be distracted by it. Also, I told him not to notify the doctors who might talk to my family members. I believe he complied with my request because the physicians did not return the psychologist and my family did not bring it up again. After a few more days of surveillance in the hospital, they discharged me since they found no more mental abnormalities and my rehabilitation was progressing nicely. Clearly, other than a tiny suitcase containing my personal stuff, I left the hospital with a different kind of burden. What had happened to me and what was still happening? How to explain and manage the subconscious events that continued to occur without explanation or awareness and what I viewed as dangerous? I was worried that if this happened while I was driving, it would result in an accident. Or what if it happened while I was out in public? Who knows where I'd end up? In addition to still hearing distant people's voices and reading people's minds. During my initial days of recuperation at home, I began to consider how I could return to some semblance of normalcy. It was all so confusing and I had no idea who to confide in. I didn't want to scare my family, so I told a couple of friends about it. But they laughed and agreed that it was best to stay quiet. When I was able to leave the house, I spoke with my doctor and discussed a few specifics. He obviously advised sedatives, but I could read his mind and tell he was considering a psychiatric treatment. I asked around for recommendations for a decent psychologist, and after doing some research, I decided on a Gestalt therapist. After a few months of individual therapy, I was introduced to a working group at a university run by this therapist. This encounter group, supervised by 2 therapists, provided a safe environment in which to identify, elaborate on, and overcome unconscious attitudes formed throughout childhood or adolescence. Gestalt therapy is actually quite effective since it addresses attitudes toward the body and bodily reactions as one expresses oneself. revealing things one does not want to communicate in nonverbal language. I made a quick improvement, aided by my extrasensory abilities, and I became useful to the two therapists. I was able to read people's minds and assist with interpersonal relationships. It was a lovely, engaging, and useful experience, but it didn't help me grasp what happened to me on June 28.